Hey everyone, welcome to the video on monotheistic philosophy. Let me first state my obligatory, probably boring at this point, comment to read the chapters as well as pay attention to the videos. There will be some questions that may be in the readings but are not in the videos, not in the lectures. So I want to start by just briefly putting back up on the screen the what is God, quote unquote, PowerPoint, because as we've already learned, there are many different ways to think about God, although there are 3 or 4 very common ways that people around the world do that. We've already looked at pantheism, the idea that God is in all things. We've looked at panentheism with Buddhism, the idea that there's a divine light or force within us, Buddha nature. And now we're looking at the idea of monotheism, the idea that God is separated from the universe. Now you notice that there's a few different ways to be a theist, or just a believer that God is separated somehow. You could be a polytheist, meaning that there are many gods who created the universe. You could actually be what some of our founding fathers were, which is a deist, meaning that God is separated from the universe and created us, but he kind of just created it and then chilled and then didn't interact with it. But the most common view of theism is monotheism. And this is the view of Christianity and Islam, and also an ancient religion called Zoroastrianism, which also posited or suggested the existence of a monotheistic God separated from the universe who created us. So just wanted to clarify where we're at here. Now, I'm also going to point out some logical errors or fallacies in discussing God that often come up, because we're trying to have a rational discussion of God. If you want to have a non-rational discussion of God, just go anywhere else. This is in my class, we're going to have a rational discussion. But I think, as you'll see, many of the great theologists over time have appreciated the value of rationality. We're not saying that everything in the universe is rational or that everything can be understood with reason, but reason is clearly useful. And so we're going to use reason here to help us understand the existence or lack thereof of a monotheistic God. Now, I want to point out that the fallacies I'm mentioning here would equally apply to some of the stuff we've talked about in Buddhism as well. For instance, when Buddhists say that there's this Buddha nature, the only evidence they provide is sort of introspection. That there obviously is some degree of faith you have to have there to believe that there's a divine light within you. So some of these fallacies would also apply to what we've talked about before. The reason why we talk about them now is because monotheism is sort of unique in its claim. Monotheists say there was a God and he created the universe. Right? That's a pretty strong claim. So presumably if you believe that, you think it's true. You don't think it's subjective. You think that God actually somehow did create the universe. So if that's the case, we can try to figure out, well, how did he create it? How did it work? How did it happen? What's the evidence that he created it? So in other words, because monotheists are making strong claims about God, that requires us to investigate them using reason and try to find the best evidence for those claims. So in order to do that, we want to eliminate the use of fallacies and biases, because remember, those derail us away from reason, from what may actually be the case. And we're thinking here not about God because it makes our lives better, not because it gives us moral guidance. I'm not saying those things are illegitimate. There are many people who get moral guidance from God, who get purpose. But in this particular section, what we're talking about is, does God actually, truly exist, and how would we know? So it's just an investigation, So one of the first ways that people sort of make a mistake in reason when talking about God is begging the question. Right? So begging the question is a fallacy. Sometimes it's just called circular reasoning that kind of just goes around in a circle. If I say that, well, you can't even question God because he created us in the first place, right? So the reason people even question God is because he created them in the first place. That already assumes that God created them. Right? It gives a reason for something that is already assumed by the question. So it sort of reasons in a circle. It's kind of like, another example is if someone said, well, you can't challenge this law because it's already the law. Right? Imagine if someone had said that about laws about slavery. So, well, you can't challenge the law about slavery because it's already in the law. And we would want to say, no, but the law is wrong. Why is the law there to begin with? So begging the question is kind of just hitting the restart button without allowing the argument to play out, without giving a justification. And if you say, well, God already created us, so why are you questioning him? You're kind of doing that. You're already assuming what you're trying to prove. Now, I want to be clear, there are good, reasonable ways to talk about God, and we're going to get to them. We're just going to go through the bad ones first so they don't bog us down. Appeal to emotion. Right? So another one is wishful thinking. Well, if there weren't a God, then the world would be less meaningful. First of all, maybe not. But secondly, we're not talking about how things would feel or be if he did or didn't exist. We're asking, does he exist to begin with? Is there such a God to even start the conversation? So we can't say it would be better or worse if this were true, right? I mean, that's what wishful thinking does. It says you replace the truth with what you want, right? But that's not reasonable. Some guys would say, well, I want Scarlett Johansson to be my girlfriend, but that doesn't mean she is, right? What you want doesn't mean it's what's true. Obviously, the appeal to authority, we want to refrain from referring to specific holy texts, and that includes from any religion, right? Now, I want to be clear. You can refer to a holy text as just sort of an example. Like, for instance, I might actually refer myself to the story of Job later when we talk about the problem of evil. What I mean by referring to holy texts, what makes it a fallacy is when you say, well, it said it in the Bible, so it's true, right? That doesn't mean we're dismissing the Bible or dismissing the Qur'an. We're just saying you can't use those alone, only, as a justification for why God exists. It's an appeal to the authority of the Bible, right? Just like, in the same way, you wouldn't imagine a Buddhist came to you and said, see, Buddha nature is true because it says so in the Lotus Sutra. That would be the same problem, right? So we don't want to appeal to things just because an authority has said them, including an authoritative book. But again, that doesn't mean we can't use passages from those books to help us understand things and the debates. Finally, there's the appeal to ignorance. Sometimes people say, well, you can't prove God doesn't exist. And that sounds really clever. And on some level, it's true. You can't prove that he doesn't exist. You can't fully, but you can't prove any negative, and that's the fallacy. You can't prove that leprechauns don't exist either. You can't prove that Santa Claus doesn't exist. Have you gone to the North Pole? Have you gone to every single possible cave and underground cavern where Santa Claus might be? Well, then how do you know he doesn't exist, right? And yet, he probably doesn't exist, right? So you can't use the logic of a negative as an evidence for a positive. And that's the problem with that fallacy, the appeal to ignorance. You're appealing to what you don't know for what we're trying to figure out. You can't say, we don't know this, therefore it's true. Now, on the other hand, if you just say, hey, you can't prove God doesn't exist, and you don't draw a conclusion from it, then there's no problem with that. So anyways, moving past the fallacies. The major ideas we're going to look at. Obviously, we have to talk a little bit about faith versus reason, because faith is a huge part of belief. And we have to know to what extent those two things can work together, if they can at all. There are some people who, sort of do the Venn diagram thing, and they say there's two separate circles. These things don't even connect. Faith is totally different than reason. There's other people who say, well, actually, there's a little bit of intersectionality here, where faith and reason kind of come together, but there's some parts that are not. That second way, the intersectionality of faith and reason, that's the way most Christian and Muslim theologists have seen this problem throughout history. So, as we'll see, for example, St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the most famous Christian philosophers, had read Aristotle heavily. He had studied all the ideas of Aristotle, and Plato and Socrates too, and many others, but he focused in on Aristotle. And he came to believe that faith and reason have to work together. And he kind of said, reason is the starting point. Reason is what gets us to help us understand God, but faith is what comes in later, after reason is limited. So reason takes you a certain way up part of the mountain, faith takes you the rest of the way. That's according to St. Thomas Aquinas and some other theologists. Now, I encourage you to reflect on, where do you come down on faith and reason? How do these work for you? And then we're going to look at some arguments for and against God. Let me remind you that an argument is not just an opinion. it's a series of claims that are logically linked and connected together. Right? Just like at the beginning in the first chapter. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, so Socrates is mortal. Right? That's not an opinion. If the first two claims are true, the third one has to be. The first two claims, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, those are premises or reasons or evidence, and therefore Socrates is mortal. That's the conclusion. So same idea. We're going to look at arguments, but in this case, instead of about Socrates, it's going to be about God. And we're going to ask ourselves, are the reasons provided good enough, strong enough to suggest that the conclusion is correct? And in this case, the first two arguments, the conclusion will be, so there's a God. So God does exist. Now we're also going to look at, as I mentioned in previous videos, the most famous argument against God, and that is the problem of evil, which is more or less, if there's a good being, why does he allow evil? Now there's some defenses of that, and I'm sure some of you are thinking, well, free will, right? He gives us free will, and we'll get there, and I'll talk about the details and the depth of that particular problem. And then finally, we're going to look at some metaphysics, which is, in particular, Christian and Islamic theology, because these beliefs, these ideas about God, are filtered through the two dominant religions that are monotheistic, and those are Islam and Christianity. So we have to kind of look at how are these religions filtering these ideas about God? And as you can probably already tell, that's where faith comes in, right? Because both a Christian and a Muslim believe in God, but at least in some cases, the Muslim thinks that his God exists and the Christian one doesn't, and the Christian thinks that her God exists and the Muslim one doesn't. Right? So obviously faith has to come in there, because reason can't adjudicate that problem. You can't argue that my religion is more true than yours based on reason, because all religions have holy books that they can appeal to. They can appeal to historical events and so forth. So anyways, I'm just illustrating how faith has to come in at some point if you want to talk about specific claims about God from particular religions. Okay, so the first guy we're going to look at, and like I do in this class, I just want to hone in on particular historical figures who were very influential. Archetypes, remember, people who provided models for those who came later. And the archetype we're going to look at is a guy named Avicenna, who is, I believe, in the West, not studied as much as he should be. And I believe this period in history should be studied more. It's starting to happen at some universities. This is a period in history called the Islamic Golden Age. So after Islam sort of dominated much of the Middle East and took over what used to be the Roman Empire, or territories that once belonged to the Roman Empire, they sort of became dominant. And as happened with ancient Greece and with Rome and with America and China and many other dominant cultures, is once you achieve that political dominance, there starts to be flourishing ideas, right? Ideas start to flourish because you're richer, you have more stuff, you have more free time. So this particular part in Islamic history, particular time in Islamic history, led to people like this guy. And Avicenna was a philosopher and actually a physician, and he wrote a book on medical science that was actually what we would call today medical science. That was actually very influential for the next 600-700 years, and even used in Europe. He also wrote about God. He strongly believed in Allah, the Muslim monotheistic God, and he used some of the same arguments that we'll be talking about today to suggest the existence of that God. Now, as we're going to see, like I said, he filtered it through his Muslim religion, just as the next guy will have filtered it through his religion. Now, the other thing I want to emphasize is that these guys were very beholden to the Greeks. The Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates, they had read and respected greatly the tradition. They even were responsible for translating a lot of it and preserving it. We may not even have books by Aristotle if it wasn't for the Islamic theologists. And there's even a quote from another guy, Al-Kindi, who states this directly. He says, "It would have been impossible for us, despite all our zeal during the whole of our lifetime, to assemble these principles of truth which form the basis of the final inferences of our research." And he said, without the Greeks, it would have been impossible for us to do this. So the Greeks and Aristotle's kind of method of reasoning and logic form the foundation for a lot of these theological ideas. So I think this is challenging the idea that faith and reason are inherently separate, because a lot of even the founders of these religions believed that faith and reason work together in some way. So in terms of the theology that Muslims are seeing the world through, and I want to be clear that this is just a very brief overview. This doesn't do any justice to the practice that a Muslim has in his or her daily life. It's much more complicated. I'm just giving some of the facts about the belief, and the same will be true of Christianity. I'm not trying to say that this is any way characterizes or fully captures the experience of these religions, but nonetheless, these are some of the core theological beliefs of them. So first of all, Muslims generally believe that Muhammad was the last and final prophet of God, who sort of came in and corrected the previous monotheistic faith. So Jesus came before, and Zoroaster became before that, so Muslims generally believe that Muhammad came in and did it better. He came in and said, this is the perfection of those previous faiths. And you can see that in the Qur'an itself, in which there are passages about Jesus. But Jesus is discussed in the Qur'an as a great leader and teacher, not as a son of God. So you can see right there is the main difference between a Muslim and a Christian. Whereas a Muslim says, I respect Jesus, he was a great man, he was a great leader. He says, but he wasn't God. And a Christian says the opposite, right? Not the opposite, but a Christian says, well, he was a great leader, but he was also God. And then a Muslim sees Allah's word, or God's word, as revealed through the Qur'an, their holy text, whereas a Christian sees it obviously as being revealed through the Bible. Both religions believe in some level of afterlife with different criteria for getting in there, but both basically believe, and this was, by the way, true of Zoroastrianism several hundred years before the time of Jesus, even before the time of the Jews, depending on which historian you ask. They also believed in a heaven and hell. So most monotheistic religions have always had this concept of, you do good stuff, you get into a good place. You do bad stuff, you go into a bad place. St. Thomas Aquinas is the one I referred to before, who is the Christian philosopher. You can see, historically speaking, he came a bit after the Islamic Golden Age, and he and many others like him, again, he's one archetype of many. He and many others like him were working with not just the translations from Arabic that the Islamic philosophers had done of the Greeks, but also the Greek works themselves, and so they had a little bit more to build upon. So they took some of the arguments from the Islamic philosophers and they made them their own from a Christian perspective. And again, I want to emphasize that filtering of these ideas through each particular historical worldview. That the power of that and the significance of that can't be underestimated. Now, there's another guy I'm just going to put a nod out to, because I myself found him fascinating, and I've read about him in a few different books, and his name is St. Augustine. And he was actually before the Islamic Golden Age. He was kind of towards the edge of the Byzantine Roman Empire, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. Although I believe he was in Egypt or North Africa somewhere. But anyways, St. Augustine was kind of one of the first ones to combine faith and reason in an influential way, to kind of put those two together and to see them as necessary. And he has a book, I believe it's called The Confessions, where if you've ever had that struggle yourself between should I have faith, what about reason, if you've ever questioned some of the teachings of your church or of your upbringing, I highly recommend that book. Now, to be fair, he's going to come down on the side of faith in the end, but it's a great journey either way. So I'm just going to recommend Augustine. Now, in this next slide, I have another one of the famous theologists of the time, and there's so many. Right? There's so many we could choose from. And this guy, Peter Abelard, he faced criticism because there were people who said, and there's people today, maybe some of you are thinking this, isn't it disrespectful to discuss God at all? Isn't it sort of an act of pride or hubris to pretend that mere mortal humans could even discuss God? Well, Abelard, a believer in God himself through and through, said absolutely not. And in that quote he says, "Man ought to direct his reason to nothing more readily than to the God in whose image he was made, since it was through his reason that he is like unto God. In other words, God created us with reason. Why would he not want us to use it even on his very existence? If God created us, he built us with a rational capacity and ability to think. Why would he want us to restrict that ability if he gave it to us to begin with? So Abelard comes down on the side of, yes, hell yeah, we should be discussing God using reason. Christian theology. So Christian theology, and again, I want to emphasize this does not do justice to the experience that Christians have of their religion. It's much deeper than this. These are just some of the core beliefs through which these arguments we'll deal with in a minute are filtered. So first of all, we have the idea of original sin from the Garden of Eden, from the Old Testament, that humans are born into sin, and that leads to the next kind of stage of the theology, which is that we need saving. And most Christians believe that saving has to come through accepting Jesus into your heart as some sort of connection with God, or having some sort of relationship with God yourself through Jesus. And again, God's word is revealed through the Bible, just like to a Muslim, his word is revealed through the Qur'an. And there's a certain grace in Christianity that God has there's a certain grace towards God that has to be felt and experienced as well, at least according to many of my Christian friends. Now I want to emphasize something about the Bible and about holy books, and that's that although Christians and Muslims both believe that the books are the Word of God, they differ in how strict they are on that claim. So for example, some argue that although the Bible is the Word of God, it's more metaphorical, and they'll acknowledge that the Bible was written by men, literally men, right? Not women, not humans, but men. I mean, that's a historical fact. They'll acknowledge that the Bible was written by men, but they'll say, nevertheless, it has this metaphorical value. In other words, they'll say, we shouldn't take most of the Bible literally, right? It should not be taken literally. On the other hand, there are what's called biblical literalists, people who think it's the Word of God, end of story, no discussion. Now, that's a much less popular view because there are passages that directly seem to contradict themselves in the Bible. Right down to, I think there's a part of the Old Testament where it says that humans were created before animals, and then in a later part of that, I think it's Genesis, it says that animals were created before humans. Right? So if you take the Bible metaphorically, it's easier to reconcile that difference. But if you say it's literal, it's harder to do that. Anyways, I'm not coming down on either side there. I just want to point out that believers in these religions have different ways of interpreting the value and truth of their holy texts. Now again, Christians also believe in an afterlife, just like Muslims. If you're saved, you go to heaven. If you're not saved, you go to hell. Obviously, they have different conditions on how one is saved as to how you get there. Okay, so that takes us through the theologies that are kind of in the background of these arguments we're now going to address soon about God. And the first argument we're going to look at is a famous argument called the first cause. Sometimes it's called the cosmological argument. And this one definitely goes back to the Muslim philosophers who based it off of Aristotle. Aquinas also made this argument, also based it off of Aristotle. And the idea is that, you might remember, Aristotle talked about causes. He said everything in the universe has a purpose, has a place. So Aristotle's all about purpose. One thing leads to another thing. The seedling sort of has the potential to become the tree, and so forth. So Aristotle looked at the universe as what we now know as a naturalist, trying to figure out how the natural world works and looking at causes and effects. Now, what these theologists did with that is they said, okay, well, let's apply this logic of causes to the very beginning of the universe itself. If there are all these causes going around that Aristotle's observed, and everything seems to have a purpose or a place, it stands to reason that there was a beginning point to all those causes. There was a beginning point to that purpose. And the beginning point, of course, is God. So let's just briefly follow the premises here. And I want to emphasize that you can see the image on the right there, which is an artist's conception of our entire universe that began with the Big Bang. So it's important to realize that this idea, this argument for God, is not incompatible with evolution or the Big Bang or science. It's merely saying there was a beginning to all of this that we now understand through science. There was a starting point that led us here. So the first premise is that nothing causes itself to exist. And that's a fair premise, because when we look around, there's nothing that just spontaneously generates. I came from somewhere. My parents created me on some level, just like your parents created you. This remote didn't just spontaneously come out of nowhere. It had to be created and put together and manufactured. And look around you in your surroundings. Is there anything that didn't come from some prior event, some prior cause? Well, no, says the theologist. Everything comes from some prior cause. Secondly, something cannot come from nothing. So this is just kind of a conceptual point that's a little bit weird in a way. It's the idea that if there were ever nothing, right? If there were ever nothing at all, there's no way logically that something could generate from that, right? If there were ever nothing, there would still be nothing. Right? The fact that there is something now suggests there was something before, meaning, namely, God, that led to what we observe now being that something. So I know that's a little bit, it messes with your mind a little bit, but it's just the idea that if there was ever if there was ever an existence of nothing, we wouldn't be here, because it would just be nothing. You can't take something out of nothing. It's not logically possible. Right? It's kind of like saying you can't have a round square. It doesn't make any sense. The third premise is that an infinite series of past causes doesn't make sense, is unintelligible. In other words, if we look around and say everything has a cause, for us to argue that it would have just gone back into infinity, that, when this thing was created, that's a prior cause, right? And there was a prior cause to that thing, and there was a prior cause to the thing before that, going all the way back to the beginning on that slide where you can see the picture at that beginning point. There's a prior cause. Now, the argument suggests it would be strange if there wasn't a beginning point to these causes. We can't say everything has a prior cause and that there's no beginning, right? That seems kind of weird, according to the argument. So those three premises logically lead to the conclusion that there must have been a God to start it all. There must have been a beginning first cause to put everything into motion. Hence the name of the argument, the first cause argument. Now I want to highlight that this is a deductive argument, so remember the difference between deductive and inductive, which, by the way, is a distinction you should know for the rest of your academic career. Very important thing to know. A deductive argument takes premises that are known and draws a conclusion that is certain based on the logic above, whereas an inductive argument is more about building up evidence for a case and saying, hey, look, he had a murder weapon, he didn't have an alibi, he probably killed that person. In that latter case, the inductive argument, it could be the conclusion could be mistaken, even if the premises are true. But in the case of the first cause argument, if the premises are accurate and true, then the conclusion would have to follow with certainty. So once again, the first cause argument is a deductive argument. Those premises logically lead to the conclusion that there is a first cause. But we can still question the premises. We can still say, but are the premises accurate? Do they make sense to begin with? And let's go premise by premise. So nothing causes itself to exist is the first premise. Now, as we talked about, there's a lot of evidence for this when we observe that nothing seems to cause itself to exist. Everything has a prior cause, but also notice that assumes determinism. Remember the idea of determinism from chapter 3 about the pre-Socratics? The idea that everything that's happening now is determined by a prior cause. That first premise seems to eliminate free will, which is sort of incompatible with a lot of other beliefs about God, because most people who believe in God believe he gave us free will. So there's a problem with that first premise in that sense that it suggests determinism. So that's one critique of this argument. Something can't come from nothing, and an infinite series of past causes is not intelligible. Let's discuss those two together. Because some people argue that an infinite series of past causes is perfectly intelligible, that it's possible that even before the Big Bang there was a previous universe. In other words, there's a bunch of Big Bangs going back into infinity. And also, if we're going to use math as a guide to reality, which we do when we build buildings, when we construct computers, obviously we're using known and well understood mathematical formulas and principles to guide our creation of those things. And yet, when we look at math, are there not negative integers? There are negative infinities, right, in math, just like there are positive infinities that are worked with in high-level mathematics. So that third premise seems to be questionable. It doesn't seem that an infinite series of causes or prior numerics is unintelligible. It seems that we could have an infinite series of causes. Now, the other problem is that the conclusion of the argument, and this goes back to the filtering of theologies I was talking about before, it's not clear what the nature of the first cause is from the argument. So, of course, when the Muslim theologists made this argument, what did they say? Well, see, this proves that our God, Allah, exists. But when Christian philosophers like Aquinas made the argument, what did they say? Well, this proves that our God, the Christian God, exists. I mean, they can't both be right? And there are some people who say it's the same God, right? That's fine. But if you're going to use it to support a particular theological idea or belief, it doesn't seem justified. And let me just put it this way. There's no reason why the first cause in this argument couldn't be Zeus. Right? There's no logical incompatibility there. There's no reason why. We just don't know. Even if we take this argument to be justified and good, leading to the existence of a God, it doesn't tell us the nature of that God. It doesn't tell us if it's Zeus, Allah, or the Christian God, Yahweh, if we're going by the Old Testament name. So that's one of the problems, some of the problems people have identified. But there's actually a deeper problem that people have identified with this argument, and that's that the first premise says nothing causes itself to exist, and yet God exists, according to the argument. So what caused God to exist then? Right? Where did God come from? What is the cause of God? What was the first cause of God? Now, some of you are probably already thinking you have a response if you believe in God. You say, whoa, wait a minute. God is different, right? God is an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving being. He's supreme. He doesn't need a cause, you might say. In other words, this objection says God is self-caused. He is an all-powerful being, so he is the cause of his own existence. So when someone challenges the argument and says, well, what caused God? You shoot back with, well, everything else needs a cause. This thing needs a cause. I need a cause. But God doesn't need a cause, because he's an all-powerful being who is, by definition, a cause of himself. Now, some people don't find that answer satisfactory, but if you do, there's still another response from one criticizing the argument. So in other words, one could say, but what about the universe? Why couldn't the universe be self-caused as well, right? So in other words, we're hypothesizing. Nobody knows the nature of God. Even if there was a first cause, nobody knows the nature. So we can hypothesize that God is a self-caused being, but it doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem like there's no reason why we couldn't also hypothesize that the universe is a self-caused entity, right? So if we're just doing with hypothesis, we're just going to butt heads here. Now, the atheist is going to add another argument as well. They're going to bring in Occam's razor. And Occam's razor is sometimes characterized as the simplest explanation is the best. But it's really more about if you have two competing... the reason why the guy Occam created the idea is he's basically saying if you have two different theories in science and they're both basically saying the same thing, but one is way more complicated than the other, you should just go with the simpler one because it's easier to work with, because they're both saying the same thing to begin with. So it's like if somebody else had come up with Einstein's theory of relativity and it was like twice as long, but it still basically said, hey, light is relative and so forth, then we would go with Einstein's because it's shorter. Now, we might apply that to God. And remember, we're trying to think of God here as an explanation for the universe. So if that's the case, many people argue, well, we need to cut God out of the explanation. Because it's already hard enough to explain the universe, right? We already know so little about the universe, and now we're going to add a whole entity like God before the universe to explain what's going on. That's going to make it even harder from a scientific perspective to explain. So anyways, there's a butting of heads that happens there at the end. And I want to remind you guys that we're not discussing this to convince anyone that they're right or wrong. We're just discussing this because it's part of slow thinking, because it makes us better people to think through these ideas. You don't have to resolve a debate or a discussion in order for it to be useful. Let's move on to the next argument. So the argument from design. This one is probably even more common and popular than the argument we just discussed. And I want to emphasize that the argument we just discussed, the first cause, is an argument for the existence of God. It's an argument that is trying to prove the existence of God. We are now dealing with the second argument that is trying to also suggest the existence of God. The next argument, the problem of evil, is the only one we'll look at that tries to say there is not a God. Right? So just make sure you're clear on the purpose of each of these arguments. So this argument by design more or less says the beauty we observe around us suggests the existence of a designer. In the same way, when I look at a beautiful picture, it suggests the existence of an artist who created that picture. And you can see how the logic plays out here. Now, I want to first mention that this particular argument takes the form of an argument by analogy. And if you ever take a logic and critical thinking class, you will learn that structure or format. An argument by analogy takes two things and connects them by an analogy, and then says, well, if they share this one thing, they probably share something else as well. You know, for example, I might say, these two people are sisters, and one is a Christian, so the other one's probably a Christian too. Now notice that the other sister might not be a Christian, but if they are both sisters, it increases the probability that they share the same religion, right? Especially if they grew up in the same household. So what I'm trying to emphasize here is that this argument is actually inductive, it's not deductive. So we're not dealing with the same structure of logic as the previous argument, which said that if these claims are true, the conclusion is certain. In this case, we're making an analogy. We're saying this is kind of like this is true, so this is probably true. So the conclusion is more based on probability, on the likelihood that there is a God. So a little different argumentative structure here. So the first thing this argument does is it says, the world is like a machine. And what that means is that, and that might be even better stated, that the universe is like a machine. What that means is that the universe has order and working parts that go together. Kind of like if you picked apart a watch and you saw that even in one of those old school like watches from the 1800s, you know, it has all those working parts in it. It has things that go together that make sense in the context of that watch. The universe is like that, right? And that's hard to deny. There are obviously natural laws, Newton's laws. There are equations of quantum physics that seem to be very predictive, that have a lot of validity for helping us understand how computers work, for example. So there are parts of the world that seem to behave in coherent, ordered ways. And so that's the first part of the argument. And then the second part is that, well, when humans create machines, they have a plan, right, of some kind. I mean, even the smallest thing like a pen or pencil, there was some design for that at the factory that then went into the creation of all those pencils that were then mass-produced. When somebody creates art, right, they have some sort of a plan in the back of their head, even if they start out in a more kind of ambiguous way, so to speak. So when humans create stuff, especially machines, we have a plan. Right? This camera that I'm staring into, clearly there was a plan behind the design of that camera. And so the argument then makes the link. It says, okay, well, we create stuff with the plan, and the world also has order and purpose, so it must have been created with a plan also. So you can see the analogy part. It's saying, well, the world is, our created stuff is like this, and the universe has similar features to our created stuff, so it must also have a design. I won't go over it now, but a famous guy named William Paley during the time of Darwin actually came up with what's called the watchmaker analogy, which is one of the more famous versions of this argument. So check that out if you get a chance, if it's not already clear what I'm talking about. Now, I want to point out, too, that it's not just design. Sorry, it's not just sort of order. It's also beauty. So there seems to be a sense of design when we look at, as in those pictures, when we look at a beautiful coast, or the butterfly's wings, or even the human eye, right? Or even love, the experience of love between people. That seems to suggest some sort of a design to those sorts of experiences and those sorts of things. So this argument, again, is making a link, an analogy between the way we create something and have a design behind it, and the way the universe is created, it may have a design behind it as well. Now, as you can imagine, there have been some criticisms of this argument over the years. And one criticism, of course, is the same one to all these arguments, is which God are we talking about here? The argument would seem to suggest, it just says God, but it would seem to support the existence of the Muslim God, the Zoroastrian God, the Greek gods, the Christian God. It's not clear that the argument proves any one particular concept of a higher being. That's where the faith would have to take over. Nevertheless, if we just think of it as sort of a monotheistic God per se, and we don't associate it with any religion, it's a stronger argument then. But then we have to ask, let's really follow this analogy out to its ultimate conclusion. And there's a famous attack of this argument, if you will, from a guy we're going to study later in the reader named David Hume. And in a dialogue called, I believe it's called Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, he mounts an argument against this argument itself. He gives a counter-argument to this argument. Remember, a counter-argument is kind of like you look at and you understand the logic given to you, like what's presented there on the PowerPoint, and then you give a response to that, why you think it's wrong. So a counter-argument is an argument against the first argument that was presented. So the counter-argument goes like this. There's a couple. One counter-argument kind of says, okay, this argument makes a comparison between the way humans create something and the way a God may or may not have created something. And this counter-argument says, isn't that a bit presumptuous? Isn't that a bit presumptuous to say God and humans are in the same category? Not only that, but Hume asks, he says, we have experienced a lot of human creation. We have a lot of experience of watching people make watches, of watching people create paintings, of watching people build houses. We have zero experience of God creation. Nobody has ever seen a God create something. Right? So Hume denies that the analogy is strong enough. He says there's not a strong enough connection. We don't have experience of God creation. It's also a bit presumptuous to even compare God to a human creation. Right? We have no idea how that works. Not only that, but think about how beings are created in nature. Do you build your son or daughter out of Legos like a child would? No, obviously we know what happens when a child is created in nature. That's very different than the way humans create things. So if nature is any guide to how the universe may have been created, for all we know, if it was created in a totally different way than the way we create something. So just to be clear, this criticism of the argument says you can't compare humans and God. You're comparing apples and pianos. They're in two totally different categories. So that's Hume's first criticism. Secondly, he says, what happens if we actually accept the logic that they're connected? What if we accept that human creation is like God creation? Well then, it's not clear that the conclusion of the argument wouldn't be polytheism. Because think about it, when humans create stuff, is it always just kind of the starving artist in his studio painting on a canvas? No, sometimes it is. But a lot of times when humans create stuff, especially machines, which the argument compares it to, there is an assembly line of workers. There are a number of different people involved in the creation of it. Let's just take a car or a computer. There's going to be the higher level thinkers who are actually putting out the blueprints and so forth. There's going to be the higher level managers who are implementing particular parts of the blueprint. There are going to be the workers on the assembly line who are, putting on the car doors and so forth. There's going to be the machines involved that are actually, as we become increasingly what's the word I'm looking for? As machines increasingly take over our workforce. Anyways, the point is, when we create something, especially something complicated, there's a lot of people involved. So if this argument makes a comparison between how we create and how God may have created, would that not suggest that it's many gods that exist rather than a single monotheistic God? That's what Hume said. So when Hume criticizes this argument, he says the conclusion would suggest that we create, that the creation of the universe was more of a polytheistic, like Zeus and Athena type thing going on. The other thing Hume says is he says, let's think about what else happens when people create. We mess up. We make mistakes. There's the proverbial image of the guy writing down, the writer writing his story and then crumpling up the paper and throwing it away, and then starting again and crumpling that up and throwing it away. If God creates like that, what if we're in a crappy universe that he threw away, right? What if that's the reason we suffer, is all he had to do was dial up the suffering knob, or dial down the suffering knob a little bit, and he just messed up on our universe? What if we're living in a universe that's crappily designed, so to speak? So because of all this, Hume rejects the argument. He says, look, and by the way, as we'll talk about later, Hume was an agnostic. He said, I'm not saying God doesn't exist. He just said, this argument doesn't prove that. This argument doesn't establish that. So anyways, that's the criticism of the argument by design. Now, I want to point out that there have been some interesting, more robust, newer arguments by design that focus in on, like for instance, what if our universe was designed by an incredibly complicated alien being who had evolved somewhere in some other universe? Now, that still wouldn't answer the question of where that being came from, but it would answer the question of how we got designed. So in other words, the argument by design becomes stronger for some people if we consider it to be designed, if we consider God to be just a highly evolved being, not unlike ourselves, but just further advanced. Kind of more like us playing The Sims, for instance. Anyways, I don't want to suggest that this argument has been disproven by Hume. It's been revamped many times, and there's a lot of interesting versions of it out there, and I encourage you to follow up on those. Let's move to the last argument, and this is an argument against the existence of God. And I'm just going to point you to the reader for this one, because I do not have the argument written on the PowerPoint, although I have that image there kind of illustrating the logic behind it. And I'm not going to give you a page because, like I said before, it changes, but towards the end of the chapter it says the problem of evil, and the argument is listed shortly after in the next couple paragraphs. So let's look at that argument very briefly. The argument says, the first premise is, if God is all-knowing, he knows every time an evil event will occur. If God is all-powerful, he has the power to prevent this evil. If he is all good, he should prevent it. He does not prevent the evil acts we observe, so God is either not all-powerful, knowing, or loving. So I want to point out that this is a deductive argument again. So the argument suggests that if we have a particular concept of God as all-knowing, all-loving, and all-powerful, which, by the way, is often in multiple religions that are monotheistic, they tend to think of God at least with those features. So it's not an unreasonable thing to assume that a monotheistic God would have those features. But the argument suggests those features are not logically compatible with the existence of evil. It suggests that if there were a good God who loved us, he would not allow those bad things to occur. And the reason for it is that he has an awareness of it because he's all-knowing. He has the power to prevent it because he's all-powerful. And if he loves us, he would prevent it. The fact that he doesn't prevent it, and no matter where you are in this debate, you have to admit that if God exists, he does not prevent all evils, right? Evils still occur, including terrible, terrible evils that befall children, right? So you can't deny that. But the argument suggests that those events, those evils, are not compatible with the nature of a good God. Okay, so I think it should be clear that this is an argument against God. The arguments we just looked at, the first cause and the argument by design, were arguments in favor of God. We're now looking at the first argument against God. Okay, so that's the argument. Now, a few things here. So, first of all, if you believe in God, but you don't believe we can know his nature, and you don't think he's all powerful, knowing, or loving. Let's say, for instance, you believe more in like a Taoist or logos with Stoics type of thing, that God is a higher force that we can't define. If that's the case, this is not a problem for you at all, right? I want to make that very clear. This is only a problem if you believe God is all loving in some way and he's powerful and knowing as well. That's where the logical incompatibility comes in. If you believe in God and think we can't know his nature, forget this argument. It does not touch your belief at all. The second point about this argument is that we are not dealing with a relativist or subjectivist account of evil. And what I mean by that is that someone might say, well, dude, evil is just your opinion versus my opinion. You think that's evil, I think that's good. This argument assumes that evil really truly exists. And this argument points to events like the Holocaust, and it says, oh, you're going to tell me the Holocaust is just my opinion that it's evil? You're telling me that Hitler putting people in ovens wasn't bad? Right? You're telling me that when a kid gets run over for no apparent reason, just because his parent was backing out and wasn't paying attention, for no reason beyond that, you're telling me that's not evil, right? You're telling me when a hurricane comes in and wipes out an orphanage and kills a bunch of innocent kids, you're telling me that's not evil, right? So this is the other barrier to this argument. If you believe evil is subjective, this argument isn't going to affect you much either. In order for this argument to, and by the way, I want to make it clear that if you believe in God and you believe he's all good, you probably don't truly believe evil is subjective. Evil, because if God is all good, that means there are objective ways to please him, right? Either things are good or they're bad, right? Because if you believe evil is subjective, then that means that you can just lie, cheat, and steal and still get into heaven, and that wouldn't make sense for a good God. So anyways, those two assumptions are crucial to this argument, that evil is real, it's there, and it happens, and it's not subjective or relative, and secondly, that the God in question is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving. Now, theologists come back from this argument and say a couple of things. The first thing they say is, look, we have to make a distinction between moral evils and natural evils. So moral evils or human-caused evils are exactly what they sound like. Hitler, the murder of an innocent person, the running over of the kid by the dad, and so forth. Those are moral evils. Those are human-caused. Now, those are explainable, right? It's clearly understandable why a good God would allow those to happen if he gave us free will, right? So if a good God gives us free will, then that leads to the possibility of us using it for good or using it for evil. So that explains why there are evil events caused by men and women in this world. That explains man-caused evil. There's no logical incompatibility there. If a good God could allow evil if it was the price we paid for having free will. Right? So this is called commonly the free will defense. The idea that the reason we have evil is because God gave us free will. Now, I just want to put a little red flag there. We talked earlier about determinism and free will, and this defense assumes that we have free will. And as we've talked about, again, in the determinism discussion, it's not actually clear that we necessarily do have free will. It's debatable whether we have free will. But if we did have free will and God gave it to us, that would explain moral evils. The problem, though, is that it does not explain natural evils. Right? You can't make the argument that, again, just use sort of a random example, that when a hurricane wipes out an orphanage, that was caused by a person. Right? Now, maybe you'll say, oh, we're contributing to global warming or whatever, but that's a hard argument to make. There's a lot of linking causes there you have to establish. Plus, what about before we were contributing to global warming? What about all of the evils that have been suffered in history from natural disasters that God allowed? So that does not explain natural evils. The free will defense, let me say again, does not explain natural evils. So what does then explain natural evils? Well, some people give up here and they say nothing. Why would a good God wouldn't allow these natural evils? So for instance, why couldn't God, he's all powerful, he knows the hurricane's going to hit the orphanage, why couldn't he just move it to the left a little? Why couldn't he just use his power to blow the hurricane away? That's the question that the atheists ask. They say, why does that happen? Now, there are defenses that some theologists have. And in fact, there's a few thinkers who have come up with something called the half-finished universe defense of the problem of evil. The half-finished universe. So this idea suggests that God created the universe for us with evil in it to fill it up with good. So we are going to deal with natural evils, which will also increase our range of choice in terms of reducing those evils. So for example, as our intelligence becomes more advanced and our technology becomes more advanced, we will discover new ways to hurt and harm people based on natural laws. Germs is a great example. So as we discover more knowledge of how germs work and how they can infect people, we have the option. We can use it for germ warfare to kill other people, or we can use it to cure diseases so people don't get, so those germs don't cause them to die or cause them to suffer. So in other words, the half-finished universe defense says that we're filling up the universe with good, but in order to do that, we're going to have these natural evils that for a while befall us, but we have to learn how to make them better. Now, in the background of this defense is the idea of God's plan, right? That God has a plan for us and a plan for the universe to make it better. And that ultimately we will realize God's plan and we will fill up the universe with good. Now, the problem that some people have with this is, yeah, okay, but you got to sacrifice a whole bunch of people along the way. So in other words, in order for us to know that the berry is poisonous, a dude has to eat it and die first. And we have to say, oh, John died. Now we know not to eat that berry. But what about John, right? What about the guy who had to be used to get there? In order for us to know that we don't want a Holocaust again, we learn from Hitler. But what about all the people that suffered in the camps and all the people who lost their entire family in order to go through that? So I'm not coming down on either side here. I'm just saying that to argue for God's plan, you have to admit that there's a lot of death and suffering that is part of God's plan that is necessary to achieve it. And it's easier to make that argument when you're not one of the ones being used for God's plan, right? But if it's you and your family who are dying and suffering to achieve God's plan, it's a little more difficult. At the same time, there's no logical incompatibility there, right? It is possible that God designed a universe where he's trying to fill it up with good, and that there does have to be some suffering for us to get there. So I want to add one other thing to this lecture before I finish up, and that's this. There's actually a new version of monotheism that has popped up, and it's very fascinating to me, and I'm calling it cosmic monotheism. And if you would like a link to a particular theologist, Christian theologist who makes this argument, I'd be happy to provide it for you. But cosmic monotheism is more or less that, because let me just back up. As you can see in this slide, there may be alien life out there, right? And we know from the scientific view of the world that we exist in one small pocket of the universe. We're in one tiny planet revolving around one tiny star in one galaxy, and there's hundreds of thousands of other galaxies and millions of other stars. So we are a small part of a great universe. And if God created this universe, you've got to account for all of that, right? Did God create the universe only for us? Or did he create the universe for multiple intelligent beings who would evolve on different planets throughout the universe? Well, cosmic monotheism suggests the latter. It suggests that together we are building this universe better, and as we discover other alien life, God may have created the universe for all of us. In fact, the purpose of the universe may not be for just humans to make it better, but for every creature involved to make the universe better. And as we advance technologically and maybe meet up with other intelligent life, we could improve this universe together, right? Maybe getting to the point where we can control natural disasters, and then there's no more death and no more suffering. Again, all of this depends on people suffering so we can get to that point. So the whole God's plan thing always comes in. Now, I've included a number of pictures here to emphasize the fact that there may be not just different types of life, but very different forms of life that could be extremely unfamiliar to us, which will challenge our theology. But there are some theologists who are prepared for this challenge. So I just include some possibilities. There's Rick and Morty. I'm not going to say the name of that creature to his right there. If you've seen the show, you know it. The Arrival. This was a great movie. It's based on a book by this guy, Ted Chiang, that I highly recommend, a short story by that guy. And he creates these aliens that are depicted in the movie that have this very interesting writing system. And the whole movie, a large part of the movie and the book is about a linguist trying to decipher their language. And so these are the sort of things that maybe someday future humans are going to deal with. And we're going to have to reconcile those discoveries with what we believe about God and what we believe about our universe. Now, before I wrap it up here, I want to say one other thing, and that's that there's a famous passage from the book, The Brothers Karamazov, at the end of the chapter on monotheism. And I highly recommend reading that. He, in it, deals with a lot of what goes through a person's mind who's a believer in God, a lot of the suffering that they have to endure. And basically what he argues there is he says, look, I can understand why God would harm a lot of adults and a lot of people who have done wrong. I can understand that it's in men's hearts and women's hearts that leads to a lot of this evil. The one thing he can't understand, though, is children. And he actually cites examples of actual newspaper clippings of children who had suffered at the hand of a lord or a king. And he says, that's what I don't get. Why would God allow innocent children to suffer? So anyways, again, not coming down on either side, just want to point out all those possible debatable topics there. All right, I'm going to wrap this one up now.